It is your go-to place for entertaining car talk, the In Wheel Time Car Talk Show. Just ahead, author of a racing safety book called Crash. Jeff has a feature on 5 Pontiacs car fans have forgotten about. And later, we'll have auto Christmas gift ideas from none other than Mercedes Lilienthal.
All right.
And the stories making auto news headlines, along with Conrad's Car Clinic.
Award-winning Mercedes Lilienthal.
Yep.
That's it.
We'll get to that.
Howdy. Along with Mike Out of This World Mars, King Conrad DeLong. We need more Jeff Zekin. I'm Don Armstrong. Hey, thanks so much for joining us on this Saturday. We truly appreciate you joining us. 2 weeks to go to Christmas. Next weekend is the Tailpipes and Tacos Cruise-In. We'll be at that. Hey, make plans to attend. Either enter your car. All you have to do is just drive into the parking lot.
Show up.
You are entered.
To get one of the chili pepper trophies that we have sitting right back here. There are 3 trophies. Yes, there are 3 trophies that are given away. And it's a great event. 3 hours, cruise in. The weather's supposed to be fantastic.
No cost to come to the show.
No, none at all.
You show up. We've got a selection committee person that walks around, checks out all the cars, and then we select the winner.
Yeah, and I've got a couple buddies of mine coming, bringing their
that's good.
Their specialty items out.
And I will tell you that it's a good thing, and any money that you spend, all of it goes to Shirley's Kids. It's a charity, and it's that time of the year that you need to give a little bit, and it'll be a good opportunity for you to get the car out. And with the weather that's supposed to be absolutely spectacular next Saturday, it's a great time.
The last hurrah
of the
before
year,
the end of the
so
year.
to speak. Yeah, exactly. So I want to talk to you now about Jonathon Ingram, and he is the author of a book called Crash. Jonathon, good morning to you.
Good morning, guys. Happy 2 weeks before Christmas.
Yeah, and same to you, too. I did not know that there was a book about racing safety, and you have authored a book called Crash. Continues to be the leading resource on the subject of racing safety. And you mention in here Jeff Gordon's 2008 Crash confirmed the role of Hans in racing safety revolution. And for those people that don't know, that are watching or listening to our show this morning, tell everybody what Hans is and what it stands for.
Well, the Hans stands for the head and neck support, because it has that name, because that's kind of a racing name. There's a lot of guys out there that have been successful going racing named Hans. But it's called the head and neck support originally because it was designed to not only save drivers from basal skull fractures in a crash. It was also the original Model 1, designed by Dr. Robert Hubbard, was designed to help a driver, in this case Jim Downing, who was the inspiration behind it, to keep his head up, more or less. You know, give him head and neck support, for example, at Sebring during a long 12-hour race with a lot of high G corners, rough track, several stints behind the wheel. Tall, slender guy like Jim, he wanted something to help give him neck support. So it had tethers on the side, the Model 1, as well as the tether in the back. And during a race, Jim could reach up and tug those tethers to tighten, give himself more neck support from the device.
And it was a basal skull fracture that ultimately killed Dale Earnhardt. And that kind of really got the ball rolling, did it not, in this particular item of safety?
Yes and no, because there were so many crashes in the 90s and 2000 that took lives as a result of basal skull fracture in major professional races. So, Adam Petty in 2000 would be one of them. Kenny Irwin, both of those were in NASCAR the summer before Dale got killed. Tony Roper, so those three guys died of basal skull fractures in 2000. So Dale was the fourth within 2 years in NASCAR. So there was just in NASCAR alone, there was that those prior deaths, and everybody thought, as usual in racing, it's not going to happen to me. When it happened to Dale Earnhardt, that really did get everybody's attention.
And for our listeners to understand, basal skull fracture, that is a fracture of one of the bones low on where your head connects to your neck. Is that true?
Yes, right in the middle, central part of the skull. That's where the neck connects and goes. Has a couple of arteries there, and those arteries run into the brain, and so there's a hole at the base of the skull, and that's where the atlas connects. The atlas divide. I'm forgetting my medical history now, but the atlas cervical, the top number one cervical bone, connects right there at that hole at the base of the skull, and that's where the major veins and arteries go in and out of the brain. So what happens when there's a fracture in that area, if it's bad, the fracture, then it severs the artery, and the person suffering the injury bleeds to death within 30 seconds. And we've seen that over time. But also Ernie Irvan, for example, or Formula One driver Mika Hakkinen, they survived basal skull fractures. It was a fracture, but it wasn't bad enough to sever those arteries. So, that's the medical event that takes place.
And the purpose of the Hans device is connects the helmet to a shoulder restraint and a shoulder harness, and that way, in a sudden impact, that bowling ball you have for a head doesn't continue to go forward and stretch and separate, causing that basal skull fracture.
Yes.
I simplified it way more than I'm sure some doctor wants me to.
Well, that you've just brought up the origin of the book. Crash from Senna to Earnhardt. How the Hans helped save racing, which I happen to have a copy of here.
Cool.
I don't know if this is on Mercedes' list, but here it is.
Very good, yes. Very good, yes. Absolutely. Well, how long did it take you to put together the book?
Well, it took a while. Let me back up. I actually worked at Hans Performance Products for a while, and I began reporting on the Hans in the early 90s. And here in Atlanta, I knew Jim Downing, based here in Atlanta. Hans Performance Products was actually making the Hans device. I covered Jim in IMSA races. He was wearing the Hans device. So I was familiar with it early on. I did the first reporting on it, and I was working for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. So and the first story would have been 1992. But if you fast forward, I was working at Hans in 2010, and I finally figured out how it worked. So your description is very apt, but what generally is not understood is that the Hans transfers the energy. That's why it works. That is the most important thing. It transfers the energy from the helmet to the tethers connected to the device, through the carbon fiber device, and into the torso. So the energy has to go somewhere, and there's a lot of it in any kind of crash that is more than 40 Gs in terms of the amount of energy coming through the cockpit. So that's what started the book. I said, holy cow, if I've been doing this for 20 years, and I didn't quite realize how it worked, there's probably a book there. And also there's, the long struggle of Jim and Bob Hubbard to bring it to everyone's attention and get it approved, accepted by drivers, mandated by sanctioning bodies. Took 20 years. That's a pretty good story as well. So I started on the book in 2012. I finished it in 2019. I had other books. There was a lot of research, a lot of interviews.
Well, and plus in that 7 years of 2012 through 2019, the technology and the data of crash protection for automotive race drivers has changed substantially. So I imagine your book had to evolve a little bit as those 7 years passed.
Well, it's a point-to-point kind of book. That's why it's called From Senna to Earnhardt. And, of course, I'm sure everyone on your panel realizes or knows that Aytron Senna was not killed by a basal skull fracture. He was killed by an errant suspension piece. But the safety revolution, it's charting more or less the safety revolution that started with Senna's death in 1994. And, of course, the day before, Roland Ratzenberger was killed by a basal skull fracture. So, but the FIA, which sanctions Formula One, was astounded and stunned by the world's reaction to Senna's death. There wasn't a lot of overt and reaction to outside of the sport to Ratzenberger's death, but it's holy cow, how can this very popular 3-time champion be killed in one of your racing cars? And if that's what happens in your sport, of course, Senna was on TV a lot. The series F1 had been on TV for a number of years, thanks to Bernie Ecclestone, had a lot to do with his popularity. So there was a huge backlash. I mean, the newspapers in Paris, Le Monde and Le Figaro, both were writing editorials about it. The newsletter from the Vatican declared Formula One to be an immoral activity, all in response to Senna, and who was sponsored by a tobacco company and had a Renault engine in his car. So that really set off a huge backlash, and Max Mosley, president of the FIA, realized that they really needed to change and address safety to prevent any driver from getting killed first in Formula One, and foremost from losing a major star. So it's a point-to-point book. Starts with Senna's death and then comes through to Earnhardt's death. And again, huge backlash, as we all know, and a lot of controversy about NASCAR's investigation. There's quite a bit in the book dedicated to NASCAR's investigation and the two books they gave the media about what happened.
Now, I know early on there actually was a competitor out there to the Hans device. I don't say competitor as, it was a competing product. But Hans is the accepted product throughout the automotive racing, call it industry now, because you watch these guys put those on. Doesn't matter what car they're getting in, whether it's sports car racing, road racing, drag racing. Everybody, if you kind of watch them, when they put their helmets on, they put the little horseshoe over their shoulders, and then the helmet clips into it, and then they strap themselves in the car. So is Hans still the predominant device everybody uses?
Yes, and the reason for that is that it was patented by Dr. Hubbard twice. Once for the Model 1, the wraparound version, which, again, appears on the cover of the book, the original Model 1 wraparound device. And then thanks to the F1 safety movement, that device was converted to a Hans that still had the same tall collar, but had two tethers at the rear, not tethers on the side. So it was no longer a device designed to save a driver in side impacts. That had to be done through cockpit surrounds, basically.
Yes.
And it instead became a frontal device and offset in 30 degrees on either side, because that's what would fit in cars better.
Jonathan, is the Hans device now mandatory for many racing series?
Mandatory. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the full.
Yes. Is it mandatory? Is it mandatory now with different racing series? For instance, does NASCAR mandate that if you're going to race our cars, you have to have a Hans device on?
You have to have a certified head restraint, and SFI. You guys probably know SFI.
Yes.
Which does all the so much testing on behalf of when they're requested by sanctioning bodies. It's so that you have to have one that's passes the test and is certified by SFI. So to go back to an earlier question, there are a number of head restraints out there. By far and large, there are more than 300,000 Hans devices. So it started the head restraint movement, if you will. As you know, in racing, if you have a product that's going to be popular or successful, etc., people will other manufacturing groups, people will try to
copy it.
inventors will come in and try to do something similar. So that's what's happened. But they do have to go through a certification process.
I'd like for you to address just for a moment here as we kind of wrap up, and that is that you mentioned on many occasions throughout the press release here about the Jeff Gordon crash in 2008. Address that for a moment, if you would.
Yeah, that's an interesting story because the sanctioning bodies, again, to go back to F1 and the death of Senna. But then you also lost Greg Moore, a rising star in kart in 1999, whose death was preceded by Gonzalo Rodriguez, who suffered a basal skull fracture. And then you lost Earnhardt. So the sanctioning bodies really began to tune in, sadly, when star drivers, known champions, guys who sold a lot of tickets began to get killed. That's what really got their attention. So Hans was mandated by NASCAR in 2001 by the end of the season. By NASCAR, it was the first one to mandate the Hans for all races. CART had mandated it for ovals. So 2008, Jeff Gordon found one of those walls that was not protected by a safer barrier at the Las Vegas Motor Speedway. He hit so hard the radiator in the front of his Hendrick Motorsports Chevy was several hundred yards down the track. And he credited the Hans for saving his life. And he also had the updated carbon seat. He was also driving the car tomorrow, which had crush paneling in it that absorbed some of the energy. He did not hit the safer barrier, which was around the perimeter outside of the track. So the outside walls. So Jeff became the first champion in NASCAR since Earnhardt was killed, to be saved by the Hans device. There were a lot of other drivers saved by it, but in Jeff's case, he was the first champion saved. And of course, he went on to do a lot more racing, and now he's a vice chairman of the Hendrick group. So, that's a very good thing. And of course, that device is in the Smithsonian, and it's now on display at the Nation of Speed show at the National Air and Space Museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C. That device that saved Jeff.
Well, Jonathan, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and what a great interview this has been. Very informative. Jonathon Ingram, author of a book called Crash, and we certainly encourage everybody that's interested to check your book out. Where can we get it? Is it available at Amazon?
Okay, thanks, guys. I really enjoyed it. Some good questions.
All right, well, thank you, and I assume that it is available on Amazon. The book, again, is called Crash, From Senna to Earnhardt. All right, time now for